Hello and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, all about trauma. Before we get started, we do have a couple of housekeeping items that we need to go over. If I could get the next slide. This webinar is being recorded and will be available shortly after the conclusion of this event through OJJDP's multimedia and YouTube pages. Closed captioning is available in the multimedia panel of WebEx. And for optimal audio, please consider using the Call Me At feature, in which you can find under the Unmute button at the bottom of your screen. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties during this webinar, please feel free to message myself, my colleague Eileen Lafergie, or Megan Nieto, and we will be happy to assist you immediately. Questions will be addressed during a Q&A session, so please feel free to address them in the chat. As well, make sure that you do provide context to your question, so that way when we do get to them at the end of the session, we can answer them appropriately and accurately. Also, a certificate will be provided to you following the end of this webinar. And without further ado, again, this is the All About Trauma webinar.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Michelle Sipple, and I'm the Program Coordinator for SHIFT here at the Innocent Justice Foundation. The Innocent Justice Foundation was founded in 2007, and we are funded by OJJDP. We're here to support ICAC task force teams and their affiliates in a hope that we can provide some tips for them to mitigate their stress. Throughout our relationship, we have understood the heavy burden that law enforcement officers have to face, and we want to provide them with a space where they can have some tools to mitigate the stress that they normalize asking for help. Today's webinar is part 2 of our well-being series, and we will be discussing all about trauma. I will now turn it over to our amazing trainers, and it's such a pleasure for me to always be here with them. And we have Carol and Chris to introduce themselves. I will mute myself and be available in the chat if you have any questions.
Thank you, Michelle. My name is Carol Brusca, and I am the embedded mental health provider for the New Mexico Attorney General's Office, the Internet Crimes Against Children, and the Human Trafficking Task Force. So what I do with for them is that I support them through brief interactions of counseling. I do some trainings, I do some tips and tools, because as we well know, they experience vicarious trauma and they have to see other people's trauma on a daily basis. So my focus is to give them the tools and techniques they can use. I also work with other victims of trauma when I'm working with individuals who've experienced domestic violence and individuals who've experienced sexual assault, as well as working in the community of people who are experiencing homelessness and those women in recovery. So I spend my days working with all different types of trauma, and because of that, I've really done a lot of research on it. And one of the things that I've recognized is that if we can break the cycle of trauma, then hopefully we can get the next generation to not carry on those same trauma traits. So I'm very excited to be here today to talk about trauma and the tools that you can use to mitigate. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Carol. My name is Chris Carlson. I come from a background that is law enforcement based. I started in law enforcement in '98, and I actually started doing computer forensics in 1999 for one of the first Internet Crimes Against Children task forces that were created by DOJ, the Northern New England Task Force. Back then, we did things a lot differently. I was cross-trained not only to do forensics, but as an investigator. And then shortly after that, they moved me over. I was promoted to detective and was transferred into the sex crimes unit. So I worked for our what you would probably know as the SVU, but we handled any sexually based offenses, and we handled all child fatalities. So not only was I seeing it on a regular basis from the child exploitation images perspective, but I was also investigating those cases while simultaneously investigating hands-on sex offenders on both adults and children, as well as child fatalities. I was promoted a number of times. I became the director of the SVU, and then ultimately was the commander of the Internet Task Force for almost a decade. You know, throughout the time that we spent, throughout the time as a supervisor of the ICAC, I saw the impact that the trauma had on everybody. And ultimately, it was around 2006, 2007 that one of my investigators had a really extraordinarily difficult time, almost left his job, almost got divorced, and then ultimately came to me, and we decided that we were going to start our own mental health wellness program because they just didn't exist. And it was really in a time when people were not asking questions. So it was shortly after that I joined the SHIFT program, and I've been training with SHIFT ever since. And it's really just a fantastic situation, and I'm glad to be with it. All right, so and I'm working on, working on a camera issue here. I apologize, mine says it's working, but so in any event, one of the things that's really important about what we're going to be talking about is to make sure that there is no stigma associated with what we're addressing. Since my time in the things that I've been to, the things that I've been exposed to, and the things that I've been through, I've really made it a point to be an open book myself, and I have no problem sharing the experiences that I've had. And we really want to make it an environment where people feel comfortable sharing experiences that they've had. And the very first thing we need to do is get rid of the stigma of this, right? I was in law enforcement very early on where you didn't talk about your feelings. You didn't tell anyone you were having a difficult time. You didn't explain that you were having marital problems or problems interacting with your own children, because if you did that, then people weren't trying to figure out how to help you. Instead, they would just rotate you out of the unit and put you back on patrol. So we've come a long way. I'm very proud of the progress we've made. Still have a long way to go, but the very first thing to understand is that we need to eliminate the stigma from these conversations, eliminate and normalize these conversations, and eliminate any negative impact that comes from people sharing their experiences, because that's how we all grow and get better over time.
So the reason that we have this picture, and if you've been on other webinars with us, you've seen the previous slide and this one in the past before, but we like to reiterate the reason that we have this slide here is because it, just like this slide with many different coats of different colors and different types, we are all individuals that have very different perspectives. We have different views on life. We come from different places. We bring our own trauma to the table, and that's going to be different for each of us. So when we think about trauma, one of the things to think about is that what I consider trauma might not be something that Chris considers trauma, or vice versa. So just like these coats of many different colors and sizes and materials, we come to this presentation with our own perspective. We are more than willing and open to and interested in hearing other people's perspective if you would like to share. But when we're speaking, we can only speak from our own perspective because that's where we come from. So please understand that we are not trying to say that when we're talking about our perspective, it's the only way to think, but it is the way that we're thinking because that's the only perspective that we have.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I mean, one of the things that's important to understand is that, I come predominantly from a law enforcement background, and my experiences are going to be law enforcement based, but that absolutely doesn't mean that you're not going to have had or are having the same exact experiences and feelings and undergoing the same things that I went through from the law enforcement background. So because we know everyone comes from a diverse background, and it's fantastic that we're getting people from different backgrounds as well, because we're all experiencing some of the same things here.
Absolutely. So for our agenda today, we're going to explore different types of trauma. If you didn't realize it, you're going to, by the end of the day, you're going to know there's more than one type of trauma. We're going to look at the causes of trauma. We're going to look at the symptoms, and then what we can do to support ourselves. So it should be, for those of you who aren't very knowledgeable about trauma, it should be very enlightening, and hopefully by the end of the day, you'll have an understanding of all of these things. Feel free, if you have questions, to write them in the chat, or we've got some questions that came in earlier that we'd like to answer. So let's go ahead and get started.
All right, thanks, Carol. So we're going to talk about three things today. We're going to really focus on trauma, but some of the things to understand is that there are different things that we're going to experience based upon what we're exposed to on any given day. One of the obvious ones is anxiety, right? Situations that cause us to be worried or nervous or afraid. And I remember that I would get anxious on a regular basis going in for a child interview. I was cross-trained as a child forensic interviewer, and those were some of the most difficult things as a detective that I had to do. And I would always feel anxious. I would always be nervous before going in there because I didn't know what I was going to hear. And I didn't know how I was going to react, because in law enforcement, whether we were talking to an offender or a victim or even a witness, one of the things that we absolutely had to do was control our responses, control our reactions, control our body language. So there was very little outlet when things were happening. So I dealt with a lot of anxiety before going into different situations. Stress. We all feel stress. If there's it's really, when you think about stress, it's any type of change that causes some sort of reaction, right? Whether it's emotional, physical, or psychological. And to back up a little bit too, one of the things that's important to understand about these three things is that they're not mutually exclusive, right? You can have anxiety while simultaneously feel stress while going through some sort of traumatic incident, right? It's not like I have one but not the other. And as we know, for those of us who work in this industry, a lot of times it's all three of them at the same time, and they're going to be compounding over time as well, right? So stress is a change that causes emotional, physical, psychological strain. And remember too, we're not just talking about the professional side, right? Because most of us have families, right? I still am, luckily. But when I was going through this, I was married. I had 3 small children. So I had all that stress. We were, remodeling homes and moving, and all the while dealing with this type of work really just added to that stress. And then, of course, one of the primary things we're going to talk about today is trauma, right? It's your emotional experience, your emotional reaction to some sort of distressing event. Oftentimes that's going to be the event is going to be something that has to do with harm coming to you or harm coming to another human being. And that is a traumatic, no matter how much you think that it may not bother you, no matter how frequently you might have been exposed to something, it always has an impact on you. And it's really important to understand. Again, these are not going to be mutually exclusive. They're going to happen simultaneously. And the whole point of having the conversation today is learning how to deal with this.
So what exactly is trauma? So as the APA, the American Psychological Association, says, it's a direct personal experience of an event that involves actual or threatened death or serious injury or other threat to one's physical integrity, or witnessing an event that involves death, injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of another person, or learning about an unexpected or violent death, serious harm, or threat of death or injury experienced by a family member. So what does all that mean in normal talk? What that means is when I witness something or when I experience something that my brain considers traumatic, I'm going to have a reaction, and it can be physically, it can be emotionally, it can be mentally, and if I see something else. So if I'm driving down the street and I get into a car accident, whether I'm injured or whether I'm not injured, that can be very traumatic for me because it's something out of the ordinary. It's something very disturbing. It's something that might replay in my brain over and over again. So that would be considered trauma. But if it's also witnessing an event that's witnessing the event, that could be I'm driving down the street and I witness another person getting into a car accident. and that plays over and over in my head. That could be considered a trauma. Now, that's just in our own personal life. If you consider all of the things that happen depending on the work that you're doing, that could be something where you're hearing traumatic stories from somebody else. It could be if you are in the line of duty where you are actually in danger throughout your day as part of your job. All of those things can be considered trauma. So again, it's going to be different for me than it is for everybody else in the room. If I've experienced a lot of traumas in my life or a lot of vicarious traumas, my window of tolerance for trauma might be a little bit better than somebody else who's never experienced a trauma. So we need to keep that in mind, and we can't, if somebody says that was really traumatic and you're thinking, that wasn't really traumatic, I go through that all the time, we have to understand that it's very, very individualized. So when I talk about something that was traumatic for me, it might be, again, it might be different from what's traumatic for Chris because his lived experience is very different from mine. I have not been in the line of duty like he has, so our levels of windows of tolerance are going to be different, and our levels of resiliency are going to be different, as well as our ability to tolerate trauma. So there are different types of trauma. There is vicarious trauma, which means the trauma happens to someone else and we witness that, and that could be in the circumstance where I'm doing work where I have to hear someone's story. So it could be I'm an advocate and I'm working with victims and they're telling me their stories. It could be I'm a therapist and I'm listening to people's stories day in and day out as part of my job. It could be I'm a law officer and I'm out in the community witnessing these things. I'm seeing people hurting other people. I'm hearing the stories. All of those things can lead to vicarious trauma. If I'm doing internet crimes against children, work, that could mean I'm actually visually seeing videos that are showing me the trauma that's happening to somebody else. But since it's not happening to me and I'm witnessing it either by hearing it or watching it, that's going to be vicarious trauma. Acute trauma, that's going to be something that is intense and short-lived. So acute trauma is, when we think about that, that might be something where it's a quick incident. So that could be something like the car accident. So it's not something that's going to happen over and over and over again, but it was intense and it was acute and it was short-lived. Complex trauma is the more than one type of trauma happening at the same time. So we're going to go into that a little bit more in a few slides. Historical trauma, we're also going to talk a little bit more about. That's trauma that goes down generations. Epigenetic and generational trauma, that's trauma that's either through our DNA or generations of trauma. Developmental trauma is another type, and that's going to be what happens through the developmental stages. System-induced trauma is when we are part of a system that causes trauma to us. And then there's grief trauma, medical trauma, and post-traumatic stress, which we are going to go in more depth about over the next slides. So when we think about vicarious and acute trauma, again, that's what we're going to do is if we're witnessing someone else's trauma. So if I'm witnessing the trauma because of, when I'm witnessing the trauma because someone in front of me is injured, whether it's in my own personal life or whether it's part of my job, that can lead to vicarious trauma. It doesn't mean absolutely that I will become vicariously traumatized. If I have the tools in place to get through that trauma, then I can mitigate the effects and I can be okay. And again, anything that would be considered traumatic can be, and that I'm witnessing could be vicarious trauma. Acute, it's that single intense traumatic event and it's isolated. So if that could be maybe I am I'm in a car accident, somebody cuts me off in traffic and it makes me swerve my car off the side of the road. It could be that I am held up at gunpoint, anything where it's acute and it's very traumatic and it's single and it's intense. So it's not something that's going to be repeating itself. It's isolated to that event. But it doesn't mean that then you just move on, because it's a trauma that can stick with you. And so then you can have flashbacks, you can relive the story or relive the images over and over and over again until you learn the tools to get through that. So acute trauma is the single intense traumatic event. Vicarious trauma is us witnessing someone else's trauma.
And I'll just, you know, from the personal experience perspective, you know, my entire career was filled with vicarious trauma, and it was on a regular basis. I was going in and interviewing children or speaking to child witnesses or other victims of crimes, and then I would have to go home and spend time with my own children. And I remember distinctly just that I was surrounded by this constant sadness, constant difficulty that specific to the different things that were happening to these children, that it made it very difficult for me to go home and interact with my own children in really in any way, much less a positive way. And it was that was not trauma that I was going through. It was just trauma that I was listening to and focusing on that happened to somebody else. So these are it has a definitive impact, even if you're not going through it yourself, for sure.
So complex trauma and PTSD. Complex trauma, where it says repeated trauma occurring over time, often starting in childhood. Complex trauma is very common with children who've experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, anything where there's a very traumatic event and it occurs over and over and over again. And like it says here, oftentimes it starts in childhood, but that doesn't mean that's the only time. We could have complex trauma that might start if you were kidnapped or if you were in a domestic violence situation. So there's the repeated traumas. You're never sure when a new one's going to happen, but you're always on the edge of fight, flight, freeze, anticipating that trauma's coming up. Then PTSD is the person who was exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. So again, this could be someone in a domestic violence situation, a sexual assault situation. It could be a situation where, again, it could be if you were in a part of war, if you were in the military, this could happen to you. If you are doing law enforcement work, this could happen to you. If you're doing anything where your life is in danger ongoing, and then you have experienced threatened death or serious injury, that can lead to PTSD. And hopefully, if you are experiencing PTSD, then you can get the help that you need. But the symptoms last more than a month. So that means if you are experiencing PTSD, you might be having flashbacks, you might be hypervigilant, meaning that you have to look around all the time because you're not feeling safe. You want to keep your back up against the wall when you go somewhere because you don't feel safe otherwise, so you have to see what's going on. So the symptoms are going to last more than 1 month. It could be that it's keeping you up late at night. It won't let you sleep. You're waking up in the middle of the night. All of the things that we think of when we think of PTSD. So it's high anxiety that doesn't go away and it stays longer than a month. And then the hypervigilance. Again, you might be afraid to leave the house because whatever the incident was, you're concerned it might happen again. Or you look all around and every person seems like they might be somebody that's going to hurt you again. Flashbacks where you are just walking down, the street, or you're walking in the grocery store aisle, or you're sitting at work, and all of a sudden the story comes back to you full force as if you're in the moment right then. Your heart starts to beat faster. You might get a little bit sweaty, and this can happen over and over and over again. It's not just like a one and done. And then, of course, the anxiety where your heart rate is increased. You're having a harder time focusing. Things just are more difficult overall.
Yeah, one of the things that actually has happened recently with my former agency is that PTSD is now an assumed diagnosis for the officers in my city. In other words, what they are saying is that if you've worked in the agency for a period of time, that it is just assumed that you now suffer from some level of PTSD. And there's some truth to that, especially in the investigations that I was doing. And I think back to hypervigilance, and when we do these trainings in person, we'll often ask the question, who will let their kids go out on a sleepover or let their children date. And usually the answer is no, never, we'll never do that. And I distinctly remember having times with my youngest son where I would go to events with him and I wouldn't be able to focus on him. I wouldn't be able to focus on the event because I'd be looking at other people. I'd be watching what other people are doing, and I'd be able to, spot the offender in the crowd. And that wasn't the case. And the result of that hypervigilance for so long is that it caused me to, it was bad enough that I would have to leave on a regular basis for the job, and I would miss out on family events because I physically wasn't present. But because of the exposure and because of what I was going through, even when I was present, then I wouldn't be in the moment. And I would miss out on events with my kids, even when I was standing there right next to them, because I was so hyper focused on everything else going around me because of everything that I had been through. So, and eventually you learn how to address this. And we're going to talk about some of these techniques today. You learn how to address this so it is not all consuming, because it doesn't have to be.
So when we think about traumatic stress is, it's like the APA says, it's a reaction to our trauma, but it's the stress that comes from from trauma. It's intense or unpredictable feelings, so we don't know when we're going to feel these things. They come out of the blue, unexpected, which makes them even more, in some ways, more scary, because it feels like we are out of control and we're kind of helpless. We're victims of the trauma. Changes to our thoughts and behavior patterns. So the way we used to think about the world can be different if we've experienced traumatic stress. So it could be that we used to feel the world was a fairly safe place, and then after this event, we feel like the world is not safe and we just need to hole up in our house because otherwise something dangerous could happen. We got to bring our kids in. We got to make sure everybody's together. So, and then that permeates to your children, to your family members, to everybody else in your environment. So it's not that we are good at keeping those things in. If we are suddenly becoming hypervigilant because of our experiences, and we're pulling people closer, we're less likely to leave our house, we're getting almost more paranoid, that's going to impact everybody around us. Sensitivity to environmental factors. So I know lots of people who've experienced PTSD or vicarious trauma that don't feel comfortable in large crowds. They don't feel comfortable being out in the open. So they want to know who's going to be there, where am I going to position myself so I'm going to be safe. All of those things can potentially happen. And then strained interpersonal relationships. If you were in a relationship where you were very well comfortable doing things in the world and you felt comfortable about the world, and then suddenly you're feeling unsafe or like the world is unpredictable, and so you pull yourself in a little bit, that's going to impact your family members who are used to you going out on the weekends and going to the movies or going to a restaurant or going to a concert. When you no longer want to do those things because it feels like you're too exposed, that's going to impact your interpersonal relations. And then stress-related physical symptoms, and those physical symptoms can be all sorts of things. We can talk about headaches, nausea. We can have chest pain that feels like you're having a heart attack when you're actually having a panic attack. And sometimes it might require medical intervention because you don't know if it's a heart attack. And then any pre-existing medical issues can get worse, because when we're under a high level of stress, that stress can impact our physical illnesses, and then might require us to have more medication because the existing medication isn't working. So if we have diabetes and we're under a lot of stress, then what can happen is we're going to require more medicine for our diabetes. Same with high blood pressure, same with anything else. So we've got to be careful that if we notice we're under a lot of traumatic stress, then we deal with it as quickly as we possibly can.
Yeah, and on top of that, there's, for me, there was a worldview change, right? Where, and Carol mentioned, environmental factors and not wanting to be around people. Well, one of the issues that I dealt with that had an impact on a number of things, not only myself, but my interpersonal relationships, was that I started to only surround myself by those with like minds and like careers, right? So I spent many, many years isolating myself from anyone who wasn't in law enforcement and only hanging out with people who did work similar to what I did. And that's okay, but the problem with that is that no matter where you are, no matter what situation you're in, ultimately the conversation is going to circle back to what? it's going to circle back to work, and it's going to circle back to the things that are causing you distress in the first place. And I never gave myself an outlet to have those what I would call normal conversations with other people, because I didn't want to be around any other people because they couldn't understand me, or so I thought. Well, the impact of that is when I left law enforcement, what happened to my social circle? It was gone, right? Where do you go? And I talk about this quite frequently. Where does a 50-year-old guy go to meet friends, right? It's a strange concept to even think about, because there I was out of law enforcement. I was no longer in the group, and I had nobody that I could talk to, nobody that I could confide in, of course, besides my family members. But that's a difficult place to be. And that was driven by the changes in my worldview, the hypervigilance, the intensity that I was operating at all the time. And that's because of the things that I went through. So if I could turn back the clock and recognize the difficulties that it would have caused long term, I certainly would have expanded my social circle and gone outside of that comfort zone a little bit, because ultimately you need to surround yourself by other people, and people with different worldviews than you, and people with different opinions than you, so you can expand yourself somewhat.
So when we look at traumatic stress and compare that to PTSD, they do initially look very similar, but traumatic stress decreases over time and PTSD does not. When we experience traumatic stress, it will eventually get less and less and less, and just being able to talk about it and just being able to have time and being able to experience some new things, that can actually help the traumatic stress decrease. But PTSD, it's stuck. And so not like you can never get over PTSD or there's nothing that will ever help, but we're just trying to distinguish between traumatic stress and PTSD. And so one of the things that lets us know that it's PTSD, not traumatic stress, is, like it said in the other slide, PTSD symptoms last over a month. So if you have experienced a traumatic event and you're not sure, one of the big indicators, it's obviously you'd have to go to get someone to actually give you a diagnosis, but one of the big indicators is as it's still going on a month later. If it's still going on a month later, then more than likely it's now PTSD. And if you're not getting better, whether it's PTSD or traumatic stress, it's a good idea to get some intervention after a couple of weeks. Don't wait until it's a month. There's no need to wait till it's a month. Don't just go in and say, this is what I experienced and can I get some help? So when I was talking earlier about historical trauma, we have heard the word more than likely historical trauma, but this is the definition that I frequently use. Historical trauma is different than consciously holding on to the past when it resides in your ancestral memory and DNA. It results in numerous defense mechanisms, developmental malfunctions, and behavioral issues. This is scientific and is supported in studies. So we know that Native peoples have, that's something that's very common, is historical trauma. And it happens because the trauma that happened from the very, very beginning of our country, and it continues actually on today. So, and it's the way that the individuals view themselves. It's the way the world views the individuals. It's carrying on that trauma through belief systems. It's carrying on that trauma through actions. And it's something that many times people recognize, but they don't even know what to do to get out of it. So historical trauma, like it says here, it's very different from holding on to the past. It's something that's ingrained in you. So it's part of your DNA. It's part of the memories from your ancestors. It's the stories that your ancestors tell. So that's what historical trauma is. Now, when we look at epigenetic and generational trauma, we've got epigenetic, which is what our parents and grandparents ate and how much they exercised and what the chemicals were they were exposed to. All of that can impact our bodies now. So there was some research done during the Holocaust that looked at mothers who were pregnant in areas where, I think it was the Netherlands, I believe, and areas that were where there were the Germans were had invaded. And the women there who were pregnant as part of the study, their children who were born after the Holocaust had a higher rate of medical issues and a higher rate of mental health issues than children born of Jewish mothers outside of Europe at the time. So they compared the two sets of parents, the two sets of mothers, and then the children, and what they saw was the stress that their mother was under while they were pregnant caused the long-term effects. And the effects didn't just last one generation. I think it was 3 generations that the effects lasted. Now, generational trauma is parental trauma responses that affect their children. And this is something that we see today at where I saw this a lot or when I'm working with women who are in recovery, and they're telling me that they're in recovery, but their mother and their grandmother are still using. So it's their mother and grandmother lived a particular way, and so the next generation comes along and they don't have any new skills. They only have the skills that they learned from their family, who learned it from their family, who learned it from their family. So it's when you don't have coping skills, you use the coping skills that came from the previous generation, and those aren't necessarily healthy. So even if you look at your own life, whether you've got any substance use issues or whether you've got any other trauma issues, we can see there are things that we carry on in our family that came from our parents and our grandparents and our grandparents' grandparents. So that's the generational trauma, which is different from epigenetic because it's not necessarily DNA related. So it's parental problems and crisis impact on kids, parental coping skills. Children can learn a trauma response to life. And the reason that this is so important to me, or the reason that I started doing my doctorate work, is because I see clients on an ongoing basis who have struggled with trauma. And many times, again, it's the previous generation that unwittingly and unknowingly had patterns of behavior that led to more patterns of behavior that led to generational trauma. So I decided I wanted to do something not on an individual basis because I wanted to hit it on a bigger level. So I decided that I really want to look at policy and law to see if we can help support children at an earlier age with coping skills. And then we're talking about developmental and system-induced trauma. So developmental trauma is when stress responses are repeatedly activated over an extended period in an infant or toddler. So this could be, again, this could be physical abuse, this could be emotional abuse, this could be sexual abuse, but the stress responses are repeated and activated over and over and over, and that leads to developmental trauma, which will impact the child's ability to grow and adapt and change. It will impact their coping mechanisms. It will impact every aspect of their life, their emotional growth, as well as their mental health. System-induced trauma is something that can happen if you're traumatized by a system. Again, jails and prisons, this could be someone as an adult that was traumatized by the system. This could be somebody growing up in foster care. Sometimes schools, not, just regular schools can have system-induced traumas. If you're in a situation where there's lots of bullying going on, whether it's through the teachers or the administrators or the children, the system of the school can induce that trauma. And then again, we have medical trauma. So medical trauma is an emotional, physical, or physiological reaction caused by medical treatment. So I have, throughout my career, I have met individuals who have experienced medical trauma, and the majority of that related to somebody getting involved with thinking they were having a particular medical treatment, but that wasn't explained to them, and so it felt like things were out of their control, and they were just being pushed from here to there, or they were didn't know what was going to happen next, and it was very scary, and they felt like they had no voice. So that can happen in a situation whether you're in an emergency room or whether you are getting a regular procedure, or if you were not clear on what was going to happen to you, medical trauma can happen. And then grief trauma, that's the impact of grief, a sudden or unexpected loss. And this could be This can be the loss of a parent, this can be the loss of a pet, a child, a friend, and it can be compounded if the loss was violent. So if you lost a friend to murder, or even if your dog, you had your dog on a walk and someone ran over your dog, all of those things can be considered grief trauma, and we hold on to it until we get some support. So when we look, we're just going to do a brief overview here, but when we look at trauma and the brain, trauma does impact our brain. So when we are experiencing a traumatic event, what happens is we go into fight, flight, freeze. And the limbic brain says, am I safe? Do people want to help me? What's going on here? And it's impacting our emotions and our physical responses as well. So our logical brain shuts down. Our emotional brain is on high alert. We are not understanding what's necessarily happening around us, or we're not being able to verbalize it because our ability to speak and know words shuts down as well. So we're just on reaction. So we're just reacting to save our life. So we might be freezing, where we feel like there's nothing we can do. We're just going to freeze. We might be trying to fight our way out of the situation or run away. But all of these things can impact our ability to get out of the situation, and that can cause the trauma. And again, if we're doing something where we're exposed to someone else's trauma over and over and over again, then each time we can go into fight, flight, freeze, or flop or fawn. And that, again, our thinking brain shuts down. We aren't able to vocalize what our emotions are. We are triggered by emotions and by our senses, and we want to do what we can. If you are in a job where this is part of your job, you want to make sure that you're doing what you can to mitigate the effects of that ongoing.
So, you know, when you contemplate, and there's some examples on the slide here, but when you contemplate the causes of trauma, all I have to look back at is think about my work, and they all kind of fall under the same category. And then you compound that with things that were going on in my personal life. So, you know, when I think about work, I'm thinking about the hours that I worked. I'm thinking about the insurmountable caseload that I dealt with on a regular basis. I'm thinking about the complete lack of support that I got from my command staff at the time, because again, remember, you know, things are better. We're doing these trainings. When I was in law enforcement, you didn't talk about it. You didn't talk about having difficulties, or else you would find yourself doing something you didn't want to do, getting pulled away from you know, where your passion was, even though it might have been causing problems. And then on top of that, you know, you're on a regular basis witnessing really horrific, tragic events, whether they were homicides, because we would get pulled into those as well. But on a regular basis, we were dealing with victims of really horrific crimes, survivors of really horrific crimes, and having to engage them in a way that they would essentially be reliving those offenses. And then you add to that the stress of anything that was going on at home, the trauma associated with events at home. If someone is sick or ill or having surgery, or a sick child, or there's an accident, all of those things, again, just like the other things that we've talked about, they're not mutually exclusive. They can pile up, and they're compounding. Not only are they compounding in the moment, but they're going to compound over time. I think what's really important to understand as well today is that it's not just the work, it's not just what's going on in our personal lives, but because of these, and I got to lean over and grab it here, but because of these devices, we are inundated day in, day out, 24 hours a day with all of the horrific, I mean, it's rare that I get a notification on my phone that's something happy, right? That, oh, hey, you know, the couple down the road just found their lost puppy. Those are not the notifications I get. The notifications I get are the really horrific notifications about the war, the multiple wars that are going on, homicides that are happening in my area. So not only are you dealing with it at work, you're dealing with these stresses and trauma at home, but you're getting constantly bombarded by this endless stream of negative information. And then I get home and I turn the news on. And but for the one feel-good report at the very end of the newscast, it's constant negative information. So there's all of this additional trauma that gets added to just having a mobile device and just turning on the news. And quite frankly, my wife and I have gotten to the point now where we rarely even watch the news. We don't have cable anymore. We really try to regulate what it is that we are taking in on a regular basis because of all this, because of my history, because of her history, as well as everything else that we're dealing with on a regular basis. So all of these things are important to pay attention to and recognize that you being exposed to this and your experiences to that, they're normal, but we just have to learn how to address that. So again, this is going to be coming from my background, right? And I know not all of you are from an ICAC background or an SVU background, but I think in looking at the attendees, most folks are involved with some sort of investigation or child welfare or something like that. But the exposure that I dealt with on work at work was on multiple fronts. I mentioned that I was a forensic examiner, so I was constantly exposed to thousands of images. I was also investigating these offenses, so I was dealing with trafficking and actual hands-on child exploitation. I was interviewing and investigating live victims, whether they were children or adults, male or female, and working with offenders. So let's not discount the impact of sitting across from one of these offenders in an interrogation room and actually engaging them in a conversation in a way that you're going to be able to get some sort of admission or confession, right? That takes its toll on you because you have to swallow everything that you're truly feeling inside, those visceral feelings that you're bringing with you. You have to swallow those and suppress those. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this type of work that we do, and I think most everybody who's in this on this webinar does, is the type of work that you cannot vent your frustration. You cannot, run outside and scream, because in the moment you have to control every part of you. If I'm doing a forensic interview of a child victim, I can't even flinch when they tell me something that would make somebody else's toes curl. When I'm in an interrogation, and they, the offender says something that's so shocking and horrific, you can't even flinch because you're going to change the dynamics of that interrogation. So, not only is there all this exposure, but then you add to that the fact that you have to control all of that, and there's very, very little opportunity for outlet throughout the day. Working with families of victims, and I will also add to this, working with families of offenders. And one of the things that I told all of my investigators when they were on my team was that do not forget that most often the offenders' families may be victims as well, and they may have had no idea what was happening, and that's also a very difficult situation to go through. And of course, there are successes, but I think most of us focus on the failures of the judicial system when it comes to addressing any of these things, whether it's the treatment of victims or whether it's disproportionate sentencing for offenders. Most of the time we are focused on the negative, which is the fact that all of the hard work we do, all of the things that are on the slide that we've exposed ourselves to and suffered through, at the end, you would hope that the light at the end of the tunnel would be that, there's some grand endpoint that puts this person away forever, or there's some sort of positive result from it. And that doesn't always happen either. So you add to it at the very end that there's a negative impact as well. So all of these things that you're exposed to, again, just like everything else, they can compound over time, and you have to pay attention to them. You have to pay attention to their impacts on you over time.
And so what are some of the signs that you might experience if you've been traumatized? Shock and disbelief. Obviously, if you're seeing something that is traumatic, shock and disbelief would be a very common reaction. It's hard for our brain to understand when we see something that's so new and that's so horrific or that's so intense. And so shock and disbelief is very common. Fear. It's a situation where we might not think fear would be something that we would experience. Fear is very common. Sadness and grief, helplessness, guilt, anger. So when we look down this list, this could be something that you're experiencing if you're investigating a crime. This could be something that you experience if you witnessed a car accident. This could be something that you experience if you just saw something happen to your pet. This could happen under any of these circumstances, and all of these things could be something that are part of the sign and symptom.
And I'll add to that, Carol. Sometimes, we think of things like fear and sadness and helplessness and shame as weaknesses, especially in the law enforcement realm. And it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be afraid. These are things that will often drive us to be better at what we do. The issue is that when it becomes overwhelming, sometimes these are normal responses, but when they become overwhelming, that could be a problem. And I think back to, from the sadness perspective, shortly after my last son was born, he was an infant, I got called to the hospital for a child fatality, and it was an infant. And it was all I could do to maintain my composure while I was talking to these parents, because my role, we investigated any child death. It was suspicious until we ruled it otherwise. And my role was not only to be there as an investigator, but, to try and be as comforting as I could to these parents. And after about 5 minutes, I had to leave the room, and I went into another room and I broke down. It was just for me, that was a warning sign that I had reached the point where I could not, it was now impacting my work. It was impacting my life. And that was a poignant moment for me where I realized that something had to change. But these reactions, these signs and symptoms are in some cases are totally normal. It's just when they become intrusive, when they become overly burdensome, that you really have to pay attention to them. And they're not necessarily a sign of weakness.
And when it says relief there, I just wanted to explain, we're not relieved that the trauma happened. We're relieved that the trauma is over. So we're relieved that that traumatic event is over. So when we see relief here, it doesn't seem like it goes in there, but there's this sense of relief, like, okay, I know it's over. So you were in this intense situation and it was very, very bad. And then, I'm so glad it's over. And some other signs and symptoms, racing thoughts. So your brain is you've got so many thoughts in your head that you can't focus, because your brain is going from one thought to the next, and you might not even remember afterwards which thoughts you were thinking or where you were going or what you were supposed to be doing, or you standing in a room where you have no idea why you're there. All of those things are common. Changes in your sleep pattern, that can happen if you are having difficulties getting to sleep or staying to sleep. And sometimes what happens is when we finally get to bed at night, then we don't have all those things that were busying our brain during the day. And so that's when all the thoughts come flooding in. Unexplained aches and pains. So if you were in fight mode and your shoulders and arms were tense, then you might have that pain. If you were in flight mode, you've got some leg tension. If you've been just holding your body tight because of the stress, that can give you aches and pains as well. And then sometimes people eat either more or less, or they're not eating as healthy as they were before, because when we are not feeling well, sometimes we crave food that's high in sugar and carbs as a way to make us feel better. Or if we have changes in appetite related to being in freeze mode. When we're in freeze mode, that typically affects the digestive system, so we could have change in an appetite due to that. And then loss of time. If we are perseverating on the event, or we just can't get it out of our head, or it feels like it's taking control of us, we might be looking at our computer thinking, staring at something, and our brain is going a million miles an hour, and then we look down and we've been sitting there staring at the computer for 20 minutes. Or we sit down to do something or watch a show, and then the credits are rolling and we don't remember anything that we saw because we were in that kind of dissociated state.
So some of the other impacts, and when you think, I think back to the physical impacts that I felt on a regular basis. One of the things that I recognized over time, and it really wasn't until I ultimately got out of law enforcement, is that I was in fight or flight all the time. 24 hours a day, it was one or the other. And I remember the distinct feeling of the actual adrenaline dumps that would occur throughout the day when, I would get a particular phone call, or a new case would come in, or I'd be told by one of my investigators that something happened in their investigation, or something else came in, I could feel the adrenaline go from the back of my neck and go all the way down my back, out to my arms, and down into the bottom of my feet. Now, if I was in a true fight or flight situation, that would be fine. But the problem was that I was typically sitting at my desk, or I was standing, and I had no way to get rid of that adrenaline dump. These muscle tension and fatigue, I mean, these are all part of things that we dealt with. And for me, fatigue was the norm. Exhaustion was when I knew that things were getting a little bit too much. It was a fatigue on a regular basis. Headaches, that was a constant theme. A very good friend of mine actually was in law enforcement for many, many years, would have debilitating headaches. He took so much Advil that his kidneys are now damaged, right? That was a red flag, 20 years ago when he first started taking them, that the headaches aren't going away and they show up the second you walk into work. That's an indicator, right? An indicator that something is wrong and some sort of action needs to be taken. So again, these are feelings that, the goal here is to recognize that they may be normal responses to trauma, but they're responses that we need to pay attention to, because over time they can have very, very damaging effects if you're not taking care of them.
And so trauma also impacts the body and physically through medical. So we can have irritable bowel syndrome. Again, that's going to be related to digestion. That could be related to being in constant freeze mode, because again, when we're in freeze mode, we can't do anything and our digestive system is all out of whack. And so that can exacerbate irritable bowel syndrome. Chronic pain, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, depression, all of these can be things that like it says here, survivors are more likely to experience this. When your body has gone through a trauma and you have not been able to successfully get through that, or if you're being traumatized over and over again, this is very common for you to have these experiences. And then there's definitely the body-brain connection. So it says trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. So what can happen is we can get trauma responses, and they are typically triggered by our emotions, by our senses, by the things that we see around us. So if I was in a car accident or I witnessed a car accident, it could be that every time I go past that intersection, I feel like I'm going, like it's all happening again. My heart starts to race, my hands get sweaty, my shoulders tighten up, and that can happen every single time. It could be, I know one of the officers the commanders that used to be our commander at New Mexico, he was in a store, Hobby Lobby store, trying to get some art supplies. And he had been looking at or listening to some video of child exploitation material. And then he went into the store to pick up some art supplies for his son who was working on a project. And he talks about how there was a child over, a couple aisles over, who started to cry. And instantly that was a trigger for him. So that child wasn't hurt. That child was just being a little bit fussy, but he was drawn to go walk down the aisle to make sure the child was okay, and then it really triggered him. So it took him a while to get back to status quo. So it could be people or their characteristics. So it could be that if something happened to you and maybe you were robbed, or maybe you were working a case where there was somebody in the whatever it was you were working in, and you see someone that looks similar or talks a certain way that's similar or dresses a certain way, that can be a trigger. Situation. So if you were in a situation where something happened at a particular restaurant or a particular area of town, when you go past that area of town again, that can be a trigger. And then your emotional state. If you were, depending on your emotional state at the time, when you are feeling more vulnerable, it can be easier to be triggered. And then we have the window of tolerance. And I talked about this earlier, but this is a great way to have it explained. So if we have our window of tolerance, and our window of tolerance is our ability to tolerate situations. So if we wake up in the morning and things are going great for us, and we win the $49 billion, or 49 million, or 100 and something $100 million lottery, and things are going well, we're thinking, oh, I'm in get this and I'm going to go help my family out and all these things. Our window of tolerance is pretty wide probably at that point because we're feeling good, life is good, things are happening that are great. So it's, I am calm enough to learn. I'm calm enough to do what I need to do. Well, if our window of tolerance is getting more and more narrow because things are happening throughout the day, somebody cut us off, we spilled our coffee on all of our clothes, somebody yelled at us when we got to the office, that's going to decrease our window of tolerance over and over. And we could either go into hyper arousal where we're in fight mode, we're fight, flight, freeze, I'm unsafe and I just have to be prepared for a fight. Or we could go to hypoarousal or dissociation where I'm too overwhelmed, I'm like a zombie, can't think, can't act, can't do anything. So what we want to do is keep ourselves in that window of tolerance where I am calm enough to learn, I'm calm enough to handle life's situations without any issue. And then how do we deal with the trauma? So there is no right or wrong way to feel. Like I've said repeatedly, each person's response to trauma is going to be different, and what we consider to be trauma is different. So there isn't any right way or wrong way to feel. And if you're working with somebody and they're telling, I don't, just get over it, or that wasn't a big deal, recognize that that's their perspective, but that's not actually the truth. And don't try to stuff or ignore the feelings. The more you do that, the more they're just going to pop up later. It's kind of like whack-a-mole. You can push them down, but they're going to pop up later somewhere else. So when you have those emotions and feelings, do what you can to work through those. And try not to relive the trauma over and over. Easier said than done. But the best way to do that is practice some of the skills we're going to talk about. And then if those aren't helping, reach out to a mental health professional who can help you get to the other side of those. And, make routines that you had prior to the traumatic event. Get yourself back into a place of structure and routine because that feels safe. And the more safe we feel, the easier it is and the faster it is for us to get through trauma. And then wait on making major decisions. Don't make any major life decisions when you are just coming out of a trauma because you might find that 6 months down the road, a year down the road, you wish you would have not made those same decisions.
And, you mentioned the whack-a-mole, and again, the historical method for dealing with the trauma associated with the things that we've talked about today was to do just that, was to ignore them. Not only to ignore them, was to hide them, right? Because any indication that I was having a difficult time with what I was being exposed to at that time was a sign of weakness. And the last thing you wanted to do was give any indication that you were quote unquote weak. The problem is that when you play the whack-a-mole, it does come up, and it comes up in typically the worst moment around the people that you don't want it to come out on. And for me, it was I could control it all day long at work. I could control it under any situation. When I got home, and one of my kids dropped a glass on the floor, or my wife told me that I had to that I forgot to take the trash out, or you name it, that's when the mole would come out, right? That's when the explosion would happen, inappropriate response to something very, very small. And it was because I wasn't paying attention to it at work, and then I was bringing it home, and it was coming out in ways that I didn't want it to come out. And for me, it wasn't until I got out of the situation, it wasn't until I extricated myself from that environment that I realized how long I had been dealing with it and how long I had been bottling it up and how I hadn't been addressing it. Had I been addressing it when it came up, had I been having these conversations again, as I mentioned on the very first slide, if I wasn't concerned about the stigma associated with how I was feeling and it wasn't a sign of weakness, then that could have changed the outcome of many situations that I dealt with during my law enforcement career. So very important to recognize that, these are, in many cases, these are normal responses, but they have to be addressed, and they have to be addressed effectively.
And so part of the way that we can effectively address those is using neuroplasticity. And basically, neuroplasticity is a fancy way of saying changing how we're thinking to create new pathways of thinking. So if you've ever stopped a habit or changed a habit, you've used neuroplasticity. If you were a smoker and you decided you wanted to stop smoking, then you created a new neural pathway. So instead of grabbing that cigarette after you had your dinner, you started to do something else instead, and that became the new neural pathway. We can do the same thing with traumatic experiences. So when we start to recognize that our heart rate is going up, we can imagine a big stop sign that says, stop, I'm safe right now, things are okay. And then when we get triggered, eventually our new neural pathway is going to be, stop, I'm okay, I don't need to worry. And that's how the pathway is going to work. So it's repetition, 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 and effort and time. So just like changing any other thinking habit, we need to repeat things, and it does take time. So when you have a negative thought, stop, replace, and repeat as needed. And this is going to help build that new neural pathway. So if I'm feeling anxious, I'm going to stop and I'm going to say, there's nothing for me to be anxious in this moment. I'm going to replace that with a thought that I'm safe and fine here. Everything is all right. And then I'm going to keep repeating that over and over again until my brain automatically does that and I don't have to give it prompts.
Right, and the only way to do that is to create what I'll refer to. I'm going to again fall back on my law enforcement experience and my training. Is one of the things that we trained on more frequently than anything else was using firearms, right? And the reason that we trained on using firearms was to create that what we called muscle memory, which was no matter what situation I was in, no matter how much stress I was under, muscle memory would take over in that situation, and I know that I could draw my weapon, get it downrange, and discharge it as I needed to end the threat. This is no different, right? You have to build this muscle memory. You have to be consistent. You can't say to yourself, and we're going to talk about some techniques today, and a lot of times we get asked the question, well, how do I know it's working? You know, because if you're like me, I try something once, and if it doesn't work, I'm out. I'm gone, right? Doesn't work. Well, that's not what we should be doing, right? And with this, especially with things like neuroplasticity, you have to do it over and over and over again, and you have to retrain your brain to handle it a different way. Right, and the only way to do that is through consistency, and it's not once. It's as Carol mentioned, when you have that negative thought, stop, replace, repeat over and over and over again, and then and over time, you're going to find that when you find yourself in that situation, you start to do it automatically. That muscle memory is now built in. It's now taking place, and you don't even have to think about it. It becomes second nature, and that's the goal, right? Where you don't have to think about it anymore.
And another part of that process really is accepting the feelings that come up. So recognize that they're coming up because your brain is trying to protect you. And this is just a function of your brain saying, I want to make sure you're safe, and this seems like it might be dangerous. So accept the feelings that come, know that this is going to pass, mourn or grieve the thought that comes up that maybe this is a reminder of that traumatic experience. Look at how you can reduce your stress and in what ways, what are the best tools for the type of stress you're experiencing. If you're at home and you're struggling, use a weighted blanket. A weighted blanket is great because it can really make you feel comfortable and safe. Amazingly so. I don't use a weighted blanket. My dogs crawl on top of me, so that's better than any old weighted blanket. Journaling is good to get your feelings out, and then making sure that you have good sleep hygiene, so you're increasing your sleep as much as possible so that your brain has a chance to repair and replenish. And then making sure that you're using coping skills. So Peter Levine, the paradox of trauma is that it has both the power to destroy and the power to transform and resurrect. So we get to the point where something happened and it feels like it destroyed us, but it also has the power to transform us to something that can be even greater than before. So dancing and rhythmic movement is a wonderful thing to do. It will get the cortisol out of our system that builds up when we experience trauma. Same reason that exercise helps. Playing a musical instrument can increase our sense of well-being and oxytocin in our body, which is going to make us feel better. Rocking and swaying is a very rhythmic movement that can help us feel safe. Grounding, we're going to go over some grounding exercises. Muscle relaxation, so doing a body scan meditation where you're focusing on individual muscles throughout your whole body, and that can be very relaxing. And then one of our favorites is breathing, which we talk about in every single training because it can help no matter what type of experience you're having.
And, you know, Just a comment on any one of those things, just like anything else in our life where we want to have a positive impact, doing these things has to be intentional. They're not going to happen on their own. We're going to talk about breathing. Obviously, we have to breathe to survive, but that's not the type of breathing we're talking about. All of these other things that we're talking about, they have to be intentional. If I want to exercise in my life, given the amount of things that I have that I'm responsible for at my work and for my family, I have to specifically set aside time to do that. And I have to be intentional about that. If I want to read, I have to specifically set aside time to do that. And I have to be intentional about it, or these things won't happen. So the coping skills that we're going to talk about, though they may seem small, they are life-changing, but you have to be intentional. You have to take the time, you have to recognize it, and you have to do it. And again, just like the neuroplasticity, you have to start building that muscle memory. You have to recognize, hey, this is a situation I'm in right now, and I need to do some grounding exercises in order to get me out of it, or I need to do some breathing. It has to be intentional. And then sooner or later, once you build that muscle memory in, your body will recognize automatically that you're in a stressful situation, you're feeling that anxiety, you have that adrenaline dump. I need to take these actions now in order to offset that. So one of the first ones we're going to talk about is grounding. And really, this is just, for lack of a better way of explaining it, it's distracting you from the moment that you're in, right? So I'm in having some sort of reaction to a stressor, I'm having some sort of reaction to trauma, and I need to break that reaction. I need to remove myself from it, albeit temporarily, in order to kind of reset. And grounding is a perfect way to do that. One of the exercises, if you could advance the slide, very simple, is just to pay attention to what it is that you're doing. And you can do it just by sitting down, which you may already be doing, but leaning back, put your feet on the ground, recognize the feeling on your back, recognize your feet on the floor, put your hand on the desk, contemplate how the desk feels. Is it cool? Is it rough? Is it soft? You can do it with items. You can, rub a piece of fabric. You can have a stress ball in your office, and one of the things that I like to do is actually turn away. If I'm going to stay in the seat that I'm in, I like to actually turn away. So I'm not looking at the screen. I'm not getting that constant bombardment of information, and I can actually focus on something else to break me out of that cycle. So can we just go ahead one slide?
Michelle's having an issue at the in the building, so I was going to ask Eileen if she might be able to change slides for us.
Thank you.
If she has the ability to do that. Perfect.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So again, the whole idea here is that you're doing something to break that moment, right? To remove yourself from that moment and feel that change. And again, breathing slowly while you are sitting is an important part of that.
And our next idea is about thumb to fingers. And so using your thumb, touch each finger in turn and count to 4. So again, just like Chris said, this is mostly about just focusing on what you're doing. When you're focused on the exact thing that you're doing, then you can't have any space left in your brain to worry about other things. So think using your thumb, touch each finger in turn and count to 4. Press gently down to each finger, focusing on the pressure. So you're bringing all of your attention to the finger, to the counting, to the pressure, to how that feels. That's going to allow you the space to get out of that overthinking that you might be in. And then, sometimes we might want to use mindfulness if that's a possibility. So using mindfulness by doing, like I talked previously, we could do a body scan meditation if possible. Body scan meditations, the one that I typically use is on a app called Insight Timer. It's free. It's something that doesn't, again, it's not gonna have an issue with cost. But it just gives you a whole plethora of different body scan meditations. I know on YouTube, they also have some body scan meditations that you can try. But what a body scan meditation does is it brings you back into your body, and you begin to feel the muscles, from every muscle from your toes all the way up to your head and all the way back down again. Great way to calm yourself. Mindful eating is focusing on every single bite that you're eating. You have your plate, and then you look at how it looks on the plate. How does the food taste? What's the texture of the food? Every little aspect of that bite that you're taking. When you're doing that, you cannot have your brain in a million different directions because you're focusing on every single bite. And then a guided meditation, and you can find hundreds of these. You can just Google guided meditation and get short guided meditations, long. You can get meditations for particular concerns. So if you're thinking that would be useful, using mindfulness would be a great way to do that. So it says mindfulness is simply being aware of what is happening right now without wishing it were different. So accepting it for what it is and then sticking it out in that moment.
There's also great apps for that. If you're looking for something to walk you right through it, you can get an app. There's tons of apps for mindfulness and meditation. So breathing, this is the one that everyone's like, well, I already breathed, so why are you talking about this? So when you are stressed out and something difficult is happening, a lot of us have a tendency to do that big inhale and big exhale sigh, right? Well, that's your body's natural response. But this is, again, backing up. This is about being intentional. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story here about how powerful breathing can be. And normally when I'm in a class, I can ask and see hands, but if anyone has ever had a bee problem in their house, we actually had a bee problem in, I think it was in May, and we had this guy come to remove what was a honeybee nest that had formed up in my attic. It was pretty good size. And the guy showed up and he did not have any beekeeper uniform on at all. He was wearing a normal shirt, baseball hat, and a pair of jeans. And the first thing I said to him is, aren't you worried about getting stung? And he said, no, all I have to do is breathe and I can change my pheromones. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry, what? But essentially what he does is he can sense when he is starting to get anxious and excited, and that's what the bees can sense as well, and that's when they attack. And these were actually slightly Africanized honeybees, so they were aggressive to begin with. And I would watch him as he was reaching into the nest and pulling these chunks of bees out, and when he would start to get anxious, he would stop, put his head down, breathe, and then he'd go right back at it. I was in the garage with him when he was doing it, and I was probably 15 feet away from him, and the sound of the bees was deafening. It was, and all I'm thinking is I'm standing there because I don't like bees. I'm not a bee guy. All I'm thinking is I'm standing there is control your pheromones. And I'm like sitting there I'm trying to breathe and trying to calm myself. But I realized after watching this guy, he literally, I think he got stung a couple times when he was outside, but he should have been, decimated by, I mean, there were probably 20, 30,000 bees that he pulled out of this house, but he was fine because he had taught himself that when he got anxious, he would go through an exercise like we're going to see on this next slide, which is he would stop, focus his thoughts, and if we could advance the slide, if we're able, he would inhale, he would hold it, he would slowly exhale, and then he would pause. And I actually watched him do it because he would put his head down and I could see him breathing as he was doing this. And he would repeat it until he got to the point where he felt his body change enough that he could go back to his work. And the reality is that if anyone has actually taken the time to do an exercise like this, when you're in the moment, when you're feeling stressed out, after you've had that adrenaline dump, when you're anxious, if you've actually taken the time to take a step back and take these 5 deep breaths in an intentional way, you will absolutely notice a change. It seems so rudimentary, it seems so elementary, and you wonder, how could this possibly have an impact? The last couple trainings we had some repeat folks come to the training again, and we asked them what was one of the things that you learned from the training that you've used on a regular basis that has helped you, and more frequently than not, it's the breathing exercise. So simple, but so effective. And if anyone needs a beekeeper guy, I got a number for you. It was incredible.
Amazing.
I'm going to be honest with you. It was an absolutely life-changing experience for me on many fronts. It was incredible to watch. So moving on.
So also important is connection and relationships. So what we know with resilience is having and using social support is the biggest indicator. So we have to expand and use our social support systems. Just like Chris said several slides ago, he needed to find some people outside of work when he was leaving work. We all need to have somebody. And it doesn't mean we have to have 35,000 Facebook friends. We need to have a couple people that we can count on and that we know are going to be there for us. We need to allocate time and attention to those people so we can keep those relationships strong. We need to play and laugh some more, because that's going to increase our oxytocin, which is going to counterbalance the effects of the cortisol. And then ask for support. If you don't feel comfortable asking for support from the people that are closest to you, get some professional support. There's nothing wrong with needing support. We don't have all of the answers. Practice compassion, giving that gratitude and love for someone else, whether it's actually just thinking about it or it's actually doing it, that's going to help as well. And then sharing meals and ideas, that's a great way to build our social circle by just enjoying a meal with a friend or with somebody, your neighbor. It doesn't have to be long, it doesn't have to be intense. Sharing a meal is perfect.
And one of the litmus tests that you can use regarding the connection and relationships and that the concept of friends is what I call the 2 a.m. friend, right? Do I have that person that I can pick up the phone no matter what day of the week it is at 2 a.m. if I'm having a situation and I need someone to be with me and to talk to me and to take time away from themselves to help me out? Do I have a friend like that? And it's important to have people like that in your life, and connections and relationships are critical. And again, if you're still on the job or still in your job, just make sure you are expanding your social circle to include people that don't do exactly what you do, that don't necessarily think exactly how you think, because that different perspective is going to actually add perspective to your life and helps you when eventually you move away from the work that you do and that you love, because eventually you will. So how do you establish long-term relationships outside of that small box?
So the essence of trauma, this is like Gabo Mategan, the essence of trauma is disconnection. So the real question is, how do we get separated and how do we reconnect, or how do we connect? And so when we think about that, we experience a trauma and it does kind of feel like we were disconnected. We felt like we were whole and then this kind of blew up and we don't feel so whole anymore. And how did we get that? And how do we reconnect? How do we get back to what we had before? Or how do we make things even better than they were in the past?
Good news is that all the things that we're talking about today, if you employ them, if you're intentional about them, if you build that muscle memory, is that people who experience trauma and successfully integrate it and recover from it are stronger, and they're more resilient than the general population, because you've been through it. You now know how to respond to it. We all know that in the line of work that we're in, that we're exposed to stress and anxiety and trauma more than the average person. And this is the light at the end of the tunnel, that you can build this resiliency and you can be stronger as a result of the things that you've gone through. So quick review, we've talked about the different types of trauma. We've talked about the causes of trauma and symptoms of trauma. And importantly, at the end, we've talked about what we can do to support ourselves. Hopefully this has been informative for you. And there's lots of resources that I'm sure Michelle can explain to folks, or can get out to folks and show you how to tap into them. But we really appreciate your time, and hopefully there's been some benefit for you here today.
So I'm not sure if Michelle is on or she's not on. I'm not quite sure. So we do have some webinars coming up, some upcoming webinars. The next month we've got worry and anxiety. Then the following month we've got post-traumatic growth, and then shielding your well-being, which is transformational meaning. So please do consider signing up for these. We really enjoy sharing the information with everybody. And if you're able to join, that would be fabulous. So remember, you might be the lighthouse in someone else's storm, and that could be you, that could be me, that could be any of you on this panel right now. You might be the one that just helps that person out by just a nice thing that you say, or by just being there for somebody when they need it. This is our contact information. If you want to reach out to us after the fact, please feel free to just take a picture of the slide right here. Then you'll have how to reach out to us, and feel free. Any kind of questions that you have, feel free to reach out. And I'll turn it back to Trevor.
All right, thank you both for such insightful information and sharing your stories. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Before we do wrap up, we do have a bit of time for some questions. During registration, we did receive a number of questions that came in. We will try to address as many as we can. But first up, I know that you did speak on, a couple of tools throughout today's presentation in terms of how to address trauma response. But would you be able to maybe just kind of note kind of which some of those tools were again in a quick review?
Yeah, and absolutely, it's going to be breathing, breathing, breathing. I tell people all the time, whether it's people when we're training, whether it's people when I'm meeting with individuals and individually for therapy, if you are experiencing a traumatic event and then you're getting triggered, self-talk is the best way to get through that. So take in some deep breaths, belly breaths all the way down to your belly, because that's going to get the oxygen into your brain and all the way out. Breathe, exhale longer than you inhale so that you can get all the used air out, and then tell yourself, I'm safe right now, everything is okay. So doing that repeatedly is going to help you if you get triggered, no matter where you are. And no one's going to know what you're doing. That's the best part about breathing as a technique. You can do some deep breathing and people aren't going to say, what are you doing over there? They're just going to think that you're taking a deep breath. If the man that was working in Chris's bee attic hadn't told Chris what he was doing, Chris would have just thought he's taking a deep breath. So you can do that without any kind of concern that people are going to ask you, that people are going to think you're doing something weird. But breathing, breathing, breathing. And then the second thing, if I had to only give you two, exercise. Getting your body moving is going to be good for you because it helps to get rid of the cortisol, but it also increases the endorphins to make you feel better. I was reading an article recently that said that running was just as effective as antidepressants in treating depression, but the benefits of running were also that people lost weight and they felt better about their bodies and they gained muscle mass. So if you can't do anything else but run and breathe, that would be giant steps towards getting rid of the trauma.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And then one of our participants asked, oftentimes entire organizations are traumatized, especially state or government agencies. What are some ideas for trauma recovery in such settings? Now, Chris, I know you spoke a lot about your experience. Would you be able to provide some insight?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is recognition, and especially with organizations, unfortunately, a lot of times what it takes is an organizational shift, right? And we, again, there have been marked improvements in this area, and most law enforcement organizations now have some sort of, hopefully, and other organizations, court, child welfare, all of these organizations should have some sort of wellness program that's designed specifically to address the trauma associated with the work that's being done by their employees, not just a cookie cutter EAP program or anything like that, but specific wellness programs. If they don't, the time is now to start developing that. But really, it's about organizational awareness. And at the end of the day, as Carol read on one of the last slide there about being a lighthouse, sometimes the difference is just the individual, right? And recognizing that you see someone going through a difficult time, recognizing that going through a difficult time is potentially a normal response to what they're seeing and what they're being exposed to, and have a conversation with that person. If you're a supervisor, seek out those resources. You have a responsibility as a supervisor to seek out those resources. And I talked about why I started my wellness program. But the reason I started my wellness program is because of my failure to recognize it happening in the first place to my own people, even though it had already happened to me, right? So if you're a supervisor, find out what resources there are. If it's a money thing, find out if there are grants available. There's a lot of different ways you can go in order to address organizational wellness, but it takes time. Be patient, persevere through it. Any of the pushback that you're going to get, because it can be a difficult process, but it is well worth it in the end.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, that is all the time that we have today. Again, I want to thank everyone for your attendance. I want to thank our speakers for, again, just being so vulnerable and sharing y'all's stories, excuse me, and really just, again, giving us valuable insight to take back to our organizations. Here's where you can contact us or find more information about OJJDP's NTech, as well as some upcoming events. If you liked what you heard today, we have a lot more coming up. As Carol also shared, there are more webinars part of this series. And then if you need any TTA assistance or looking for assistance for your organization, please feel free to reach out to us at tta360.com or .ojjdp.gov and go ahead and submit that request. And again, this webinar will be available on OJJDP's multimedia page, as well as their YouTube channel, in which I have shared in the chat. So please be on the lookout for that if you'd like to review this information. Here's where you can connect with us. And thank you, everyone. Y'all have a great day.